CEO asked the boy's age, discovered the shocking result of his one-night stand with her, and then did what no one expected. Hey there, my amazing story family! Welcome back to another heart-touching video on our channel. I've been reading through all your beautiful comments on our last video, and they filled my heart with so much joy. You know what would make me even happier? Seeing your thoughts about these stories that I pour my heart into. If you've been enjoying our journey together, drop a big yes in the comments below and tell me, how would you rate my storytelling so far on a scale of 1 to 10? Your feedback lights up my day and helps me understand what touches your hearts the most. Also, when you share your perspective, it often helps me see new layers to these narratives that I hadn't even considered. That's what makes this family so special. We all bring our own experiences to these stories and learn from each other along the way. You know, my wonderful story family, every single day I dedicate 8 to 10 hours crafting these stories just for you. It's more than just storytelling to me, it's about creating moments that touch your hearts and bring us closer together. Your support means everything, and watching this community grow fills me with pure joy. The best way you can encourage me to keep going is by hitting that like button, sharing your heartfelt thoughts in the comments, and also sharing our stories with your close friends. Each one of your responses makes those long hours of writing worth every minute. And hey, if you're new here, this is your formal invitation to join our story family. By hitting subscribe, you'll join us to explore these incredible journeys together. Make sure you tap that notification bell too, so you'll be the first to know when I drop a new story. Trust me, you won't want to miss what I have in store for you next. Now, we're about to meet Cinnamon, whose one unforgettable night led to a decision that would reshape her entire world. What happened next will touch your heart in ways you never expected. So, take that second right now to engage, whether it's subscribing if you're new, dropping that yes if you've been enjoying my stories, or sharing where you're watching from. Let's dive into this extraordinary story together. The glass and steel facade of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel stretched toward the moonless Boston sky, its golden lights casting long shadows across the marble steps. Cinnamon Matthews pulled her worn leather jacket tighter around her shoulders, trying to steady her trembling hands. The evening air held a crisp December chill, but it wasn't the cold making her shake. She'd avoided this place for 7 years, sworn she'd never set foot in here again. But desperation had a way of breaking promises. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she stepped through the revolving doors, each sound echoing like a countdown in her mind. The lobby sprawled before her, a cathedral of luxury that made her increasingly aware of her thrift store dress and scuffed shoes. The same crystal chandelier still hung above, throwing rainbow prisms across the faces of guests who belonged here, unlike her. Wealthy couples drifted past in designer clothes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. A bellhop pushed a cart stacked with Louis Vuitton luggage. Everything screamed money, power, privilege, all the things she'd walked away from that morning 7 years ago. Cinnamon's fingers brushed the front desk's mahogany surface as she approached, remembering the last time she'd stood here. She'd been different then, younger, more naive, full of dreams about medical school and changing the world. Now she was back, but not for herself. The weight of why she'd come pressed down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. She had to do this. She had no choice. Not anymore. Cinnamon's hand moved to her purse, fingers tracing the outline of the folded papers inside. Dr. Wilson's letterhead. The hospital logo. The impossibly large numbers at the bottom of each page that seemed to grow with every appointment. $78,000 and counting. Numbers that haunted her dreams and filled her waking hours with constant, gnawing dread. She'd tried everything. Extra shifts at the diner. Weekend work cleaning houses. The night job at the convenience store that left her eyes burning from exhaustion. She'd sold her car, pawned her mother's jewelry, even cashed out the tiny retirement account from her brief stint as a hospital administrative assistant. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The medical bills kept coming, each with more urgency than the last. Final notice stamped in angry red letters. Phone calls she could no longer bear to answer. The pediatric specialist had been kind but firm last week. Without the treatment, Tommy's condition would worsen. The clock was ticking, and her son's life hung in the balance. The worst part was Tommy's bravery through it all. "Don't worry, Mommy," he'd whispered last night, his small hand patting hers as she tucked him into bed at her friend Jenna's apartment. "I'm strong like a superhero." The memory made her throat tighten. Yes, her boy was strong, stronger than any 7-year-old should need to be. But even superheroes needed help sometimes. Across the vast expanse of the Grand Metropolitan's lobby, Blake Morrison paused mid-conversation. Something had caught his attention, a flicker of movement, a familiar silhouette that sent an unexpected jolt through his system. The board member beside him continued talking about quarterly projections, but Blake's focus had shifted entirely. "Mr. Morrison?" "The financials," the man prompted, holding out a leather portfolio. "Give me a moment, Jack," Blake said, handing his whiskey tumbler to a passing server without looking. His eyes remained fixed on the woman at the front desk. At 45, Blake had built Morrison Enterprises from the ground up, transforming a small tech startup into a Fortune 500 company that dominated the East Coast. His face regularly appeared in business magazines, his name synonymous with calculated risk and ruthless precision. The Wall Street Journal had once called him the human algorithm, a man who made decisions based purely on data and advantage. Today had been typical: 14 hours of meetings, 3 major deals closed, a charity gala appearance scheduled for later. He'd stopped by the hotel only to review plans for tomorrow's board presentation in the penthouse conference room. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to disrupt the clockwork precision of his life. Until now. Blake straightened his custom Italian suit jacket as he moved forward, his 6'2" frame commanding space without effort. Hotel staff nodded deferentially as he passed. He'd owned the controlling interest in the Grand Metropolitan for 5 years now, another calculated acquisition that had doubled its value. He knew every inch of this property, had personally approved the recent renovations, yet suddenly it felt like unfamiliar territory. Because of her. He hadn't seen that particular shade of cinnamon-colored hair in 7 years. Hadn't thought about that night in, well, that wasn't entirely true. The memory surfaced occasionally during rare moments of weakness, usually late at night when the penthouse felt too empty, too quiet. A remembrance he'd always pushed away, filed under distractions in the organized cabinet of his mind. The front desk attendant was explaining something to Cinnamon, his voice gentle but firm. She was shaking her head, pleading in hushed tones that carried just enough for Blake to catch fragments, just 5 minutes of his time, and wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Blake slowed his approach, suddenly uncertain, a foreign sensation for a man who made million-dollar decisions without hesitation. What was she doing here? What could possibly have brought her back after all this time? Then, as if sensing his presence, Cinnamon turned. Their eyes locked across the remaining distance, and the busy hotel lobby seemed to freeze around them. Recognition flashed across her face, shock, then something else. Fear? Determination? Both? For Blake, it was like being thrown back in time. Those eyes, deep amber with flecks of gold that caught the light. They were exactly as he remembered, though the carefree sparkle had dimmed, replaced by something harder, more weathered. The years had changed her, had carved new lines around her mouth, had stolen some of the softness from her face, yet she was unmistakably the woman who'd vanished from his hotel room at dawn 7 years ago. His body remembered her before his mind could fully process the moment, the quickening pulse, the tightening in his chest, the sudden dryness in his throat. Reactions he hadn't experienced since her. "Sir? Mr. Morrison?" The desk attendant had noticed him, was now standing at attention. "This woman was asking to speak with you. I explained that appointments need to be—" "It's fine, Michael," Blake heard himself say, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I know Ms. Matthews." Cinnamon's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected him to remember her name. But how could he forget? He'd repeated it to himself so many times that night, each syllable like honey on his tongue. It had been the only real thing he knew about her. She'd been careful to share little else. The charged silence between them shattered as a young boy's voice called out, "Mom! They have fish in the wall!" A small figure darted through the crowd, weaving between designer luggage and tailored suits with the nimble energy only children possess. He skidded to a stop beside Cinnamon, his oversized blue backpack bouncing against his narrow shoulders. His eyes were wide with excitement, cheeks flushed from running. "There's a huge fish tank over there with fish I've never seen before." One was electric blue with yellow stripes, and the boy stopped mid-sentence, suddenly aware of the tension surrounding the adults. His gaze shifted curiously to Blake. Blake couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The world tilted beneath his perfectly polished shoes as he stared down at the boy. 7 years old, if he had to guess. Dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that was hauntingly familiar. But it was the eyes that made his heart stutter, deep blue with a distinctive grey rim around the iris. Morrison eyes. His father's eyes. His own eyes. Looking at himself in miniature. "Tommy," Cinnamon said softly, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. This is Mr. Morrison. He owns this hotel." "Whoa, cool." Tommy grinned, revealing a missing front tooth. He stuck out his small hand with surprising confidence. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison. Your fish tank is awesome." Blake's gaze flicked from the boy's hand to Cinnamon's face, which had drained of color. She gave an almost imperceptible nod, confirming the question blazing through his mind. "Now, my dear family, I know you can already feel the tension in that hotel lobby right now." The way Blake's world just stopped spinning as he looked into eyes identical to his own. Stay with me, because what happens in the next few minutes will change these lives forever. This unexpected reunion is just the beginning of a story that will take you on an emotional rollercoaster you won't want to miss. If you're invested in what happens next between Cinnamon, Blake, and little Tommy, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't done that yet. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts. Now, let's continue. 8 years ago, Blake Morrison wasn't yet the business titan who commanded respect with a mere presence. Back then, he was the hungry up-and-comer, the dark horse candidate that industry veterans had foolishly underestimated. At 37, he had just secured the Patterson contract, the one everyone said was impossible, the one that would later become the cornerstone of his empire. The night of that victory, the champagne had flowed freely in the Morrison tech offices. His small team of 20 employees celebrated in their modest downtown space, furniture still bearing the scuffs from the startup they'd bought out. Blake had joined them briefly, accepted their congratulations with rare smiles, but his mind was already racing forward, calculating the next 3 moves on his strategic chessboard. "You should enjoy this moment more," his CFO, Richard, had told him, clapping him on the back. "You just accomplished the impossible." But Blake hadn't built his burgeoning company by dwelling on victories. He'd grown up watching his father's construction business falter because the old man rested on laurels instead of innovation. "Nothing is impossible," Blake had replied, "just improbable until someone finds the right approach." He'd left the celebration early, retreating to the quiet of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, not as its owner then, just as a guest who appreciated its discreet luxury. The Patterson contract would change everything. Within weeks, they would need to triple their workforce. Within months, they would outgrow their office space. By the following year, Morrison Tech would be positioned for the public offering that would catapult Blake's net worth into 9 figures. Success tasted sweet, but Blake had learned long ago that attachment to the moment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not with competitors circling, not with markets shifting, not with the ghosts of his humble Cleveland beginnings still nipping at his heels. He had clawed his way from nothing, had paid his way through college washing dishes and driving cabs, had sacrificed any semblance of normal relationships for the single-minded pursuit of his vision. While Blake was celebrating his business breakthrough, Cinnamon Matthews was 20 miles away in a cramped university library, surrounded by towering medical textbooks and empty coffee cups. At 20, she was the first in her family to attend college, carrying the weight of generational hopes on her slender shoulders. "Matthews, you're still here." "It's almost midnight," Professor Winters said, finding her hidden in the anatomy section. "The exam isn't for 3 days." "I know," Cinnamon smiled, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "But I need to beat my 92 from last semester. Med schools don't take chances on good enough." Her path to medical school wasn't just a career choice, it was redemption, purpose, an escape all wrapped into one white coat dream. Growing up in Boston's working-class Dorchester neighborhood had shown her too many families destroyed by inadequate healthcare, too many neighbors forced to choose between medicine and food. Her mother had been one of them. Linda Matthews had ignored her symptoms for months, hiding the pain while working double shifts at the diner to keep Cinnamon in school. By the time doctors found the cancer, it was too late. Cinnamon had been 17, holding her mother's hand as she made her promise, "Finish what you started. Become the doctor I never had." 3 years later, Cinnamon was achingly close. Her GPA was stellar, her MCAT practice scores promising. She'd applied for every scholarship, worked as a research assistant, tutored freshmen for extra cash, and picked up weekend shifts at a local cafe. Sleep was a luxury she'd reacquaint herself with after medical school acceptance letters arrived. That night, she finally closed her books at 1 a.m., her eyes burning from exhaustion. Her roommate had texted, "Party at Landon's." "Coming?" Cinnamon almost declined, as she usually did. But something, perhaps the knowledge that she'd been running herself into the ground for weeks, made her respond, "Give me 30 minutes." She couldn't afford much of a social life, but tonight she needed a break. Just a few hours to remember she was 20 years old, to feel normal. Her carefully planned path to medical school would still be there tomorrow. The Grand Metropolitan's Azure Lounge was never meant to be Cinnamon's destination that night. The party at Landon's had been a disappointment, too crowded, too loud, with cheap beer and conversations that couldn't compete with the blaring music. Her friend Kate had suggested they upgrade their evening. "My cousin works at this fancy hotel downtown," Kate had whispered conspiratorially. "Said he can sneak us into the bar." just for one fancy drink. Come on, when's the last time you did something spontaneous? Cinnamon had relented, following Kate into a world that existed in perfect contrast to her ordinary life. The azure lounge gleamed with subtle wealth, blue lighting casting an otherworldly glow over leather and chrome, bartenders in vests mixing drinks that cost more than her textbooks, patrons whose relaxed postures suggested they belonged amid such luxury. Act like you own the place, Kate had advised before disappearing with a finance guy who'd bought her a martini, leaving Cinnamon alone at the bar, feeling increasingly out of place in her simple black dress from Target. She was about to leave when the bartender placed a glass of amber liquid before her. Courtesy of the gentleman at the end of the bar, he said with a discreet nod. Blake Morrison hadn't planned to notice anyone that night. He'd come downstairs merely to have a single drink before reviewing contract details in his room. But something about the young woman had caught his attention, perhaps how clearly she didn't belong there, yet held herself with unmistakable dignity. Or maybe it was the way she studied everything around her with intelligent curiosity rather than entitled boredom. "I didn't order this," Cinnamon said when he approached, her voice carrying a gentle but firm boundary. "Fair enough," Blake replied, taking the stool beside her only after she nodded her permission. "What would you order if you were ordering?" She'd assessed him then, those amber eyes taking his measure with surprising directness. "Something I could afford," she finally said with unexpected honesty. Which isn't much on this menu. Most women in Blake's experience tried to impress him. This one seemed refreshingly unconcerned with doing so, and somehow that was more intriguing than any practiced flirtation he'd encountered. "I'm Blake," he offered, without adding his last name or anything about Patterson Contracts or Morrison Tech. "Cinnamon," she replied with a hint of a smile. "And yes, that's my real name. My mom loved spices." What started as simple conversation transformed into something neither expected. Minutes stretched into hours as they discovered an effortless rhythm, their words dancing between serious topics and unexpected laughter. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was, in a natural, unassuming way that made the carefully cultivated women in his circle seem suddenly artificial. It was how her mind worked, quick and curious, challenging his thoughts rather than merely agreeing with them. "You're wrong about healthcare being purely a business," she argued, eyes flashing with passion. "Some things shouldn't be reduced to profit margins." He found himself genuinely considering her perspective instead of dismissing it, something rare in his winner-takes-all world. When their fingers accidentally brushed reaching for the same dish of almonds, the contact sent an electric current through them both. Their eyes met, the conversation momentarily paused by something more primitive and powerful. Blake had experienced attraction before, had enjoyed his share of brief relationships with women who understood his boundaries. But this pull towards Cinnamon felt different, magnetic and almost uncomfortable in its intensity. Each time she tucked her hair behind her ear or leaned forward to make a point, his focus narrowed to the movement, to the curve of her neck, to the way her lips formed certain words. And he could tell she felt it too. The flush that wasn't from the cocktail she nursed. The way her sentences occasionally trailed off when their gazes held too long. The slightly deeper breaths when he moved closer. "It's getting late," Cinnamon finally said, glancing at her watch. Past 3 a.m., the evening had vanished without either noticing. "I have a suite upstairs," Blake said, then quickly added, "That came out wrong. I meant for one more drink. The view of the city is worth seeing." She studied him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. "Just for the view," she agreed, though both recognized the thin pretense. In the elevator, they stood inches apart, the small space charged with unspoken intention. His suite on the top floor opened to floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Boston's glittering skyline, but neither of them looked outside for long. Clearly, both of them felt the same energy between themselves. It wasn't long when their eyes met again and the remaining distance between them vanished. Their first kiss was tentative, questioning, a gentle press of lips that asked permission. The second answered with certainty, deepening as his hands found her waist, drawing her closer. Her fingers traced his jawline, then slid into his hair as the kiss transformed into something hungry and urgent. "Tell me to stop," Blake murmured against her neck, giving her one last chance to walk away. "Don't stop," she whispered, her hands already working at his tie. What followed was a discovery of each other, first hurried, almost desperate, clothes abandoned in their path to the bedroom. Then slower, more deliberate, as they learned what made the other gasp and tremble. His hands mapped every curve of her body as if committing it to memory. Her lips traced patterns across his chest, savoring the taste of his skin. In the dim light filtering through the windows, they moved together with surprising synchronicity, as if they'd known each other's bodies for years instead of hours. When he lifted her onto the bed, her legs wrapped around him naturally, pulling him closer. The world outside ceased to exist, narrowed down to the heat between them, to whispered words and shared breaths. "Look at me," he commanded softly as they found their rhythm. Their eyes locked, adding an unexpected intimacy that transcended the physical. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection neither had anticipated nor knew how to name. She called out his name as she came undone beneath him, her body arching against his, triggering his own release. Afterward, they lay tangled in expensive sheets, her head on his chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her spine. Sleep came eventually, her body curled against his arm draped protectively around her waist. For the first time in years, Blake's mind quieted, the constant calculation silenced by her steady breathing beside him. When his phone alarm chimed at 6 a.m., he reached to silence it, careful not to wake her. But his hand found only empty space and cooling sheets. Blinking away sleep, Blake sat up, suddenly alert. The bathroom door stood open, dark and empty. The suite was silent. "Cinnamon," he called, though he already knew she was gone. On the nightstand where his watch and wallet remained untouched, he found a hotel notepad with her handwriting, "Thank you for a beautiful night. This stays where it belongs, as a perfect memory." See? No phone number. No last name. No way to find her. Blake moved through the room, collecting evidence of her brief presence. A long auburn hair on the pillow. The faint scent of her perfume lingering on the sheets. The impression of her body still visible on the mattress. She had slipped away like a dream, leaving reality strangely hollow in comparison. He stood at the window, watching the sun rise over Boston, a city of nearly 700,000 people. Finding one woman who clearly didn't want to be found would be nearly impossible, even for someone with his resources. Part of him respected her choice, understood the wisdom in keeping their encounter contained to a single perfect night. He had no room in his life for relationships, no desire to complicate his focused existence with emotional entanglements. This clean break was practical, rational, exactly how he approached everything else. Yet something unfamiliar tugged at him as he showered and dressed for his 8 a.m. meeting. Something that felt uncomfortably like loss. Present day, back in the Grand Metropolitan lobby. Blake's expression hardened as he processed what he was seeing, what he was beginning to understand. The boy's eyes. His own eyes, staring back at him with innocent curiosity. "Tommy," Cinnamon said gently, "would you mind checking out that amazing fish tank for a few more minutes?" I need to talk to Mr. Morrison about something important. Okay, Mom. The boy was off like a shot, backpack bouncing as he raced back to the aquarium across the lobby. Blake waited until Tommy was out of earshot before speaking, his voice low and controlled despite the storm raging inside him. My office. Now. He led the way without looking back, knowing she would follow. Hotel staff scattered before him, sensing his tension. The private elevator required his keycard, whisking them silently to the executive floor. Neither spoke during the ascent, the small space filled with questions too explosive to touch. Inside his corner office, floor-to-ceiling windows offered the same Boston skyline they'd gazed at 7 years ago, though now from a different vantage point. Blake closed the door, then turned to face Cinnamon. She stood straight-backed and resolute, despite her obvious anxiety. How old is he? The question cut through the silence like a blade. 7, she answered, meeting his gaze directly. No hesitation. No attempt to lie. 7. Blake repeated the number, doing the mental calculation even though he already knew the answer. And you never thought to tell me? Not once in 7 years did you consider that I had a right to know about my own son. I didn't know how to reach you, she began, but he cut her off with a sharp laugh. Please. I was in the Boston Business Journal that very week. My company went public 9 months later. Finding me wouldn't have required much effort. Fine. Her chin lifted slightly. I chose not to tell you. I made the decision knowing exactly what it meant. You had no right to make that choice for me, Blake said, his voice dangerously quiet. No right to keep my son, the word caught in his throat, still foreign and enormous. Blake moved to the window, needing distance, needing to breathe. The city stretched below, but all he could see was the boy's face. His son's face. He has your eyes, Cinnamon said softly behind him. Exactly your eyes. I knew it the moment he was born. Blake turned back to her, his composure slipping. It's not just the eyes. It's everything. The way he stands. The set of his jaw. Even that thing he did with his hand when he introduced himself, that's my father's gesture. His voice caught on the last words. He reached for his phone, pulled up a photo gallery, and turned the screen toward her. A boy around 9 or 10, standing proudly with a fishing rod. The resemblance was undeniable, the same dark hair, the same thoughtful expression, the same dimple when he smiled. That's me, summer of 1989, Blake said. Tell me you don't see it. Cinnamon's shoulders dropped slightly. Of course I see it. I've seen it every day for 7 years. Sometimes it's like looking at a miniature version of you. Does he ask about me? The question escaped before Blake could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than he'd intended. All the time, she admitted. I told him his father was a good man who didn't know about him. That someday, when the time was right, they might meet. And you decided today was that day? After 7 years of silence? His tone hardened again, anger resurfacing. Why now, Cinnamon? What changed? She looked down at her worn purse, at the medical bills hidden inside. When she raised her eyes again, they shimmered with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. Because Tommy needs you now. And I have nowhere else to turn. Blake moved to his desk, needing the solid mahogany barrier between them, needing to regain control of this situation that was rapidly dismantling everything he thought he knew about his life. Tell me exactly, he said, his businessman's mind taking over, compartmentalizing emotions to deal with facts. When was he born? The exact date. September 28th, Cinnamon answered. 8 months after that night. Blake's mind instantly calculated backward. Late January, almost February. The Patterson contract celebration. The night at the Azure Lounge. The impossible connection with a woman he'd known for hours. His son had been conceived that very night. He was premature, Cinnamon continued, seemingly reading his thoughts. For weeks early. The doctors were concerned at first, but he was stronger than anyone expected. A hint of pride colored her voice. He's always been strong. Blake pulled out his chair and sat heavily, the reality of fatherhood crashing down on him with each passing second. I need to know everything. His full name. His medical history. He trailed off, suddenly realizing how much he'd missed, how many firsts he would never witness. First steps. First words. First day of school. Thomas Blake Matthews, she said softly. I gave him your name as his middle name. It felt right. Something shifted in Blake's chest, a strange, painful warmth spreading outward. The boy carried his name. Had done so all along, unknown to him. And he's healthy? Apart from whatever brings you here today? The question was pointed, reminding them both of the unspoken reason for her appearance after all these years. Cinnamon moved closer to the desk, her fingers gripping its edge. He was perfectly healthy until 6 months ago. Then he started getting headaches. Became dizzy sometimes. The pediatrician thought it was just migraines at first, but... Her voice wavered slightly before steadying. An MRI showed a tumor. It's rare but treatable with the right specialist. The survival rate is excellent with proper care. Care you can't afford, Blake finished for her, understanding everything now. She nodded once, her pride visibly battling with maternal desperation. The treatment costs more than I'll make in 10 years. I've tried everything, Blake. Everything. The night we got the diagnosis, Cinnamon said, her voice softening as she continued, Tommy asked me if he was going to die. 7 years old, and he was trying to be brave for me. She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. I promised him he wouldn't. That mommy would fix everything. She moved to the window, needing a moment to compose herself. The first round of treatments drained my savings. I sold everything I could sell. Worked every extra shift they'd give me. Some nights I'd get home at 2 a.m., catch 3 hours of sleep, then be up again to get Tommy to school before heading to the next job. Blake watched her silhouette against the Boston skyline, noticing how thin she'd become, the exhaustion evident in the slope of her shoulders. The hardest part, she continued, is pretending everything's normal. Tommy knows we don't have much money, he's smart, observant, but I've tried to shield him from how bad things really are. Last month, our electricity was shut off for 3 days. I told him it was a citywide problem, made it into a camping adventure with flashlights and blanket forts. She turned back to face Blake, her expression resolute despite the vulnerability in her eyes. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I need you to understand why I'm here. 2 weeks ago, the specialist said Tommy needs to start the next phase of treatment immediately. The tumor is growing faster than they expected. Without intervention, he could lose his vision. Eventually, it could be fatal. Her voice broke on the last word, the facade of strength finally cracking. I've never asked anyone for help. Not once in my life. But this isn't about me. It's about Tommy. And I would do anything, sacrifice anything, to save him. Blake stood abruptly, needing to move, to process the hurricane of emotions battering against his carefully constructed walls. A son. He had a son. A boy with his eyes, his name, his blood. A boy who was sick and needed him. For 7 years, he'd built his empire with single-minded focus. No distractions. No attachments. No weaknesses. His board members joked that he was more algorithm than man, making decisions based purely on data and advantage. He'd cultivated that reputation deliberately, knowing emotion had no place in business. Yet here was Cinnamon, crashing back into his life with news that changed everything. And despite his anger at her deception, despite the rational part of his brain calculating the complications, something else stirred within him. Something primitive and powerful. Protect. Provide. Parent. If what you're saying is true, he said carefully, if Tommy is indeed my son, then of course I'll ensure he gets the best medical care. That's not in question. Thank you, Cinnamon whispered, relief flooding her face. But you need to understand what this means, he continued. Financial support is one thing. But if I acknowledge Tommy as my son, it will open doors you can't close. My life isn't private anymore. There will be scrutiny, questions, expectations. He paused, confronting the truth he'd been avoiding since seeing the boy. And if he's my son, I want to be part of his life. Not just paying bills from a distance. I want legal recognition. Visitation rights. A role in decisions about his future. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Cinnamon. Until speaking them aloud, Blake hadn't realized how deeply he meant them, how fiercely this newfound paternal instinct burned. His logical mind screamed warnings, this will disrupt everything you've built. This will expose vulnerabilities you can't afford. This will change the narrative you've carefully crafted. But looking at the photo of Tommy still displayed on his phone, at this child who somehow existed in the world with half his DNA, his family features, his name, Blake knew with unexpected clarity that nothing would ever be the same again. And strangest of all, part of him didn't want it to be. There's something you need to understand about my position, Blake said, returning to his desk chair. Morrison Enterprises isn't just a company. It's a brand built on my personal reputation. He pulled up his calendar on the computer screen, revealing back-to-back meetings, events, and obligations stretching months ahead. In 2 weeks, we announce our acquisition of Westfield Technologies. Next month, I'm speaking at the Global Business Forum. 3 months from now, we launch the Morrison Foundation with a gala that's already sold out. Cinnamon frowned, not seeing the connection. What does any of that have to do with helping your son? Public perception, Blake explained, his tone measured. For the past decade, I've been portrayed as the focused visionary who sacrificed personal attachments for professional excellence. The media loves that narrative. Investors trust it. It's part of what makes our stock valuable. He pulled up a financial news site where his name featured prominently. The sudden appearance of an unknown 7-year-old son will trigger questions about my judgment, my honesty, my priorities. It suggests secrets, hidden liabilities. Tommy isn't a liability, Cinnamon said sharply. Not to me, Blake agreed, surprising himself again with how much he meant it. But to shareholders who only care about quarterly profits? To board members concerned with company valuation? To competitors looking for any weakness to exploit? The revelation will impact more than just my personal life. He leaned forward, trying to make her understand the complexity of his position. The Morrison Foundation is focused on children's education. The irony of launching it while the public discovers I've ignored my own child for 7 years won't be lost on anyone. The press will have a field day. You didn't ignore him, Cinnamon interjected. You didn't know. And how many people will believe that? Blake countered. That a man with my resources and connections never discovered he had a son? That his mother never attempted to contact me until she needed money for medical bills? The optics are problematic at best, devastating at worst. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. I'm not saying these considerations outweigh Tommy's needs. I'm saying we need to be strategic about how we handle this. For everyone's sake, including his. Blake's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. He glanced at the screen, then answered with a curt, "Morrison." As he listened, his expression darkened. "When?" he asked. "Who tipped them off?" "I see." No comment until further notice. Absolutely nothing. "I'll handle it." He ended the call, setting the phone down with deliberate care. That was my PR director. Apparently, a reporter from the Boston Chronicle is asking questions. Someone from the hotel staff noticed our interaction in the lobby and recognized you. Cinnamon paled. Already? But how would they even know who I am or why I'm here? They don't, yet. But they're digging. Blake stood and moved to a small bar hidden in a cabinet, pouring himself a glass of water. Hannah Miller has been trying to get a personal story on me for years. She's relentless and well-connected. Is this reporter a threat? Cinnamon asked, her protective mother instinct visibly flaring. Information is always a potential threat when you're in my position, Blake replied. Right now, they only know that a woman and child had some kind of interaction with me that seemed significant. They are fishing. He returned to his desk, pulling up a secure messaging app. I need to alert my legal team. If this breaks before we have a plan in place, the narrative will be out of our control. Cinnamon wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly looking small in the vast office. I never considered this aspect. I just thought about getting help for Tommy. The media doesn't care about intentions, Blake said, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he typed instructions to his team. They care about stories that sell. Tech CEO's secret love child appears after 7 years will sell very well indeed. He looked up, seeing the fear on her face. We need to get ahead of this. If Tommy is going to be treated at top medical facilities, we can't keep this quiet for long. Too many people will know. What does getting ahead of it mean exactly? Cinnamon asked warily. Controlled disclosure on our terms. DNA testing to confirm paternity, though I don't think that's necessary given what I saw. Legal documents establishing my rights and responsibilities. A prepared statement for the press. Blake's CEO persona had taken over, handling this family crisis like any other business challenge. And then what? Cinnamon pressed. What happens to Tommy when the world knows he's Blake Morrison's son? The question hung in the air between them, bringing Blake back to the most important reality, a 7-year-old boy with a medical crisis who was about to have his world turned upside down. Mom? Tommy's voice came from the doorway where he stood with a security guard who looked deeply uncomfortable. "This man said I couldn't come in, but I saw you through the glass and you looked sad." Cinnamon quickly composed her expression. "It's okay, sweetie. Mr. Morrison and I were just having an important talk." The security guard looked to Blake for direction. "Sir, I'm sorry." He slipped past reception and, "It's fine, Jim," Blake said, waving him off. "Thank you." Tommy entered the office cautiously, his blue backpack clutched in front of him like a shield. His eyes, Blake's eyes, widened as he took in the expansive space, the view, the evident luxury. "Whoa," he breathed. "Your office is bigger than our whole apartment." Blake felt a smile tug at his lips despite the tension. "It's probably unnecessarily large," he admitted. Tommy approached his desk, curious but polite. "Mom says you own this whole hotel?" "That's pretty cool. My friend Lucas's dad owns a sandwich shop, but this is way bigger." "Tommy," Cinnamon said gently, "Mr. Morrison is very busy. We should—" "It's okay," Blake interrupted, unable to take his eyes off the boy. "I'm not too busy for Tommy." The child climbed onto one of the leather chairs across from Blake's desk, his feet dangling above the floor. "Mom told me my dad doesn't know about me yet," he said matter-of-factly. "But someday when I'm better, we might find him." Blake's eyes met Cinnamon's over Tommy's head, a silent exchange passing between them. "Do you have any kids, Mr. Morrison?" Tommy asked innocently, completely unaware that he was speaking to his father. "I do have a son," Blake said, looking directly at Tommy. "I just haven't had the chance to know him yet." The simple truth in his words caught Cinnamon off guard. She watched as Tommy's face lit up with interest, completely unaware of the deeper meaning behind Blake's statement. "That's sad," Tommy said with a child's blunt honesty. "Everyone should know their kids. My mom says knowing me is her favorite thing in the whole world." "Your mom is very wise," Blake replied, his voice softening in a way Cinnamon hadn't heard before. Tommy looked around, fidgeting. "Can I go see the fish again?" "The blue one looks like the one in my science book." After Cinnamon nodded her permission, Blake asked his assistant to accompany Tommy back to the lobby aquarium, leaving them alone once more. The office felt different now, the air between them charged with something more complicated than their earlier tension. "He's remarkable," Blake said, watching through the glass walls as Tommy disappeared into the elevator. "Smart. Observant. He gets that from you," Cinnamon admitted. "The way his mind works, it's exactly like yours." Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, it was 7 years ago again, that instant connection that had drawn them together despite all logic. The memory of their night together hung between them, unspoken but undeniably present. Blake moved from behind his desk, closing some of the physical distance between them. "Why didn't you stay?" he asked quietly, the question he'd held for 7 years finally finding voice. "That morning." "Why disappear?" Cinnamon took a deep breath, her composure wavering under the intensity of his gaze. "Because I saw your world when I woke up. The call's already coming in at 5 a.m. The document spread across the suite's desk. I realized I'd been a momentary distraction from your real life." "You were never just a distraction," Blake said, moving closer still. "I looked for you. Not right away, I respected what I thought was your choice. But later, when I couldn't stop thinking about that night, I tried to find you." The revelation stunned her. "You did?" Yes. One simple word that changed everything she believed about that night, about him, about the choices she'd made. Blake caught himself, stepping back slightly. What was he doing? Sharing personal feelings wasn't part of his carefully constructed plan. He'd meant to approach this situation clinically, verify paternity, arrange medical care, set legal parameters, manage public relations. Instead, he found himself revealing vulnerabilities he never acknowledged to anyone. Something about Cinnamon still dismantled his defenses with unsettling ease. "I should call Dr. Warner at Boston Children's," he said, deliberately shifting to practical matters. "He's the leading pediatric neuro-oncologist in the country. He owes me a favor." Cinnamon nodded, visibly gathering her own composure. "Thank you. That would be incredibly helpful." Blake made the call, his CEO voice returning as he explained the situation in clinical terms, pulling strings that would get Tommy an appointment the very next day. Throughout the conversation, he felt Cinnamon's eyes on him, watching this display of power wielded on her son's behalf. When he ended the call, she was standing by his desk, examining a framed photograph, the only personal item in the otherwise pristine office. "Your parents?" she asked. "Yes," Blake replied, surprised she'd noticed it. Most people didn't. The small silver frame was easy to overlook among the awards and business mementos. "They died 5 years ago. Car accident." "I'm sorry," she said, and he could tell she meant it. Tommy would have been their only grandchild. The observation hit him with unexpected force. His parents had never known they had a grandson. Would never know. "We'll need to decide how to tell him," Cinnamon said softly. "About you being his father." The word "we" hung in the air between them, creating an instant connection, a partnership neither had anticipated when the day began. For a man accustomed to making unilateral decisions, the concept should have been uncomfortable. Instead, it felt strangely right. "Yes," Blake agreed. "We will." His assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Mr. Morrison, the board members are assembled in the conference room for your 2 p.m. Should I tell them you're delayed?" Reality intruded, reminding Blake of the empire waiting just outside his office doors, of responsibilities and expectations built over years of calculated focus. Yet for the first time, that world seemed somehow less substantial than the conversation happening inside these walls. "Reschedule them," he heard himself say. "Something more important has come up." The afternoon stretched into evening as Blake and Cinnamon mapped out the coming days. Tommy's medical appointments. Legal steps to establish paternity. Contingency plans for media attention. Throughout it all, Tommy remained in the hotel, alternating between exploring the public areas with Blake's trusted assistant and joining them in the office. It was during one of these moments that Blake truly began to know his son. Tommy had pulled a small notebook from his backpack and was carefully sketching the Boston skyline from Blake's office windows. "You like to draw?" Blake asked, moving to stand beside the boy. Tommy nodded earnestly. "Mom says I have an engineer's eye." "Engineer's eye," Cinnamon corrected with a smile. "Yeah, that. I can see how things fit together." Tommy pointed to a skyscraper in the distance. "See how that building has those diagonal supports? That's so it doesn't fall when the wind pushes it." Blake stared at the boy in amazement. "That's exactly right." "How did you know that?" Tommy shrugged. "I read a book about buildings at the library. The librarian lets me have extra time with the grown-up books if I'm careful with them. Pride swelled in Blake's chest, a foreign but powerful emotion. I used to sketch buildings too, when I was about your age. Really? Tommy's eyes widened with delight at finding this connection. Mom, did you hear that? Mr. Morrison likes buildings too. I heard, Cinnamon said softly, watching them with an expression Blake couldn't quite decipher. For the next half hour, Blake showed Tommy some basic architectural principles, guiding his small hand through sketches of load-bearing walls and cantilevers. The boy absorbed everything with remarkable comprehension, asking questions that sometimes stumped even Blake. When Tommy finally tired and curled up on the office sofa for a nap, Blake and Cinnamon found themselves standing side by side, watching their sleeping child. He has your mind, Cinnamon whispered. I've always known it, but seeing you together, it's remarkable. He has your heart, Blake replied. Your kindness. Your resilience. Their shoulders brushed as they stood in comfortable silence, this unexpected moment of shared parenthood creating a bridge between their separate worlds. Blake felt a strange peace settle over him, something he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. For once, the constant churn of business strategies and market forecasts had quieted in his mind, replaced by something both simpler and infinitely more complex. As evening fell, Blake arranged for a suite at the hotel for Cinnamon and Tommy. Despite her initial protests about the extravagance, she finally relented when he pointed out the practicality of staying close to his office while they sorted through the complicated days ahead. He should be coming with me to the children's hospital tomorrow morning, Blake said as they stood in the hallway outside the suite, Tommy already asleep in the bedroom beyond. As his father. Cinnamon leaned against the doorframe, exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. Are you sure? Once we tell him, there's no going back. For any of us. I've never been more certain of anything, Blake replied with a conviction that surprised them both. I've lost 7 years already. I don't want to lose another day. The raw honesty in his voice seemed to touch something in Cinnamon. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers lightly grazing his forearm. Thank you. Not just for the medical help, but for wanting to know him. He deserves a father who wants to be there. I'm not doing it out of obligation, Blake said, suddenly needing her to understand. When I look at Tommy, I see everything I never knew I wanted. Everything that's been missing. Their eyes met in the dim hallway, words failing as the gravity of their shared connection settled around them. They'd created a life together, a brilliant, beautiful boy who somehow embodied the best of them both. He asked about you tonight, Cinnamon said softly. While you were on that business call. He said you must be very important because everyone in the hotel seemed scared of you, but that you didn't seem scary to him at all. Blake's throat tightened. What did you tell him? That sometimes people who seem important just need friends who see them as they really are. A small smile touched her lips. He said he'd like to be your friend because you know cool things about buildings. The simple, innocent offer of friendship from his own son nearly undid Blake entirely. In boardrooms and business negotiations, he was legendary for his emotional control. Yet here in this hotel hallway, he found himself fighting back emotions too powerful to name. Cinnamon, he said finally, his voice rough with feeling, we're going to tell him tomorrow. Together. And then we're going to beat this, whatever it takes. Our son is going to be fine. This time, when her hand found his, neither of them pulled away. The morning had started with such promise. Tommy's face had lit up with wonder and confusion when they'd sat him down for the most important talk ever. "You're my dad?" he'd asked Blake, his small face scrunched in concentration as he processed this life-changing information. "Yes," Blake had answered, his heart hammering. "I am." After a moment of serious contemplation, Tommy had simply nodded and said, "That makes sense. We both like buildings." Then he'd launched himself into Blake's arms with the unquestioning acceptance only a child could offer. That perfect moment now seemed a lifetime ago as Blake paced the sterile hallway of Boston Children's Hospital. Inside the emergency treatment room, doctors swarmed around Tommy's small form while Cinnamon clutched his hand, whispering reassurances. It had happened so suddenly. One minute they'd been in Dr. Warner's office reviewing treatment options, the next Tommy had clutched his head, crying out in pain before collapsing into Blake's arms. The seizure that followed had seemed to last an eternity. "Mr. Morrison." Blake turned to find Dr. Warner approaching, his expression grave. "The tumor is pressing on his optic nerve and temporal lobe. The pressure has increased significantly since his last scan. That's what triggered the seizure. Can you operate?" Blake demanded, CEO instincts kicking in, identify the problem, find the solution, implement immediately. "Yes, but there's a complication. The location is tricky. The standard approach has risks of vision loss, cognitive impacts." "What's the alternative?" "There's an experimental procedure, a targeted approach using advanced laser technology. Higher success rate, minimal side effects." "But—" "Do it," Blake interrupted. Dr. Warner shook his head. "It's not that simple. The equipment is only available at 3 hospitals worldwide. The nearest is in Zurich. We'd need to medevac him there immediately." "Fine. Make it happen. Mr. Morrison, even with your resources, this is complicated. International medical transport, specialized surgical team, extended recovery, we're talking millions, and insurance won't cover experimental treatments. Money isn't an issue. Time is." Blake pulled out his phone, already dialing his chief of staff. "I want the company jet ready in an hour. Call Zurich University Hospital and tell them Blake Morrison is bringing his son for the laser procedure. Whatever permissions, paperwork, or payments they need, make it happen." Dr. Warner nodded, impressed despite himself. "I'll start preparations on our end." As the doctor walked away, Blake looked through the window at Tommy, pale, small, attached to monitors, and felt a fear unlike anything he'd ever known. Blake's phone hadn't stopped ringing since they'd arrived at the hospital. His assistant, his executive team, his board members, all demanding his attention for the Morrison Enterprises emergency board meeting he was missing. A meeting called specifically to address that developing situation with his newly discovered son. "Blake, you need to take this call," Richard, his CFO and oldest friend, said when he finally reached him in person at the hospital. "The board's threatening a vote of no confidence." "My son is having a medical emergency," Blake replied coldly. "The board can wait." Richard lowered his voice. "They're not waiting." Hannah Miller from the Chronicle published the story an hour ago. Tech CEO's secret love child revealed after 7 years. Stocks already down 8 points. Blake glanced through the window where Tommy was finally stabilized, Cinnamon still at his side. "I don't care." "You have to care," Richard insisted. "Everything you've built is at risk. The Westfield acquisition, the IPO expansion, the foundation launch, it's all in jeopardy." Put the meeting on video conference. I'll dial in from here. 10 minutes later, Blake sat in a small consultation room, facing his laptop where 12 board members stared back at him with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed anger. This PR disaster couldn't come at a worse time. Victoria Harrington, the board chairwoman, began without preamble. The Westfield deal is hanging by a thread. Then shore it up, Blake replied tersely. That's your job. Our job is to protect shareholder value, another board member interjected. Value that's evaporating while you're distracted by personal matters. Personal matters? Blake repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. My son, yes, my son, is fighting for his life down the hall. I call that a priority, not a distraction. Victoria leaned forward. Blake, no one's questioning your right to be with your child. But the timing and circumstances have created a perception problem. The narrative is that you abandoned your responsibilities. I didn't know he existed, Blake cut in. The public doesn't believe that, Victoria countered. And perception is reality in the market. We need damage control immediately. Another board member, Howard Larson, cleared his throat. We've drafted a statement. It acknowledges the boy as your son, but emphasizes that this was a brief relationship years ago, that the mother never informed you, and that you're taking appropriate responsibility now while remaining committed to the company. It also, Victoria added carefully, creates some distance between you and daily operations until this blows over. Temporary leave of absence. Just for appearances. Blake's jaw tightened. And if I refuse? Then we put it to a vote, Victoria said. Your leadership versus company stability. Cinnamon found Blake in the consultation room after his video call ended, his face set in hard lines she'd never seen before. Even during their confrontation in his office, he'd maintained the controlled composure that seemed central to his identity. Now, something had fractured in that perfect facade. What happened? She asked. Nothing important, he answered, but his clenched fists told a different story. Blake, she said softly, we promised honesty, remember? For Tommy's sake. The mention of their son's name seemed to deflate him. The board wants me to take a leave of absence. Distance myself from the situation until it blows over. The bitterness in his voice was palpable. Cinnamon sank into the chair opposite him, the implications washing over her. Because of us. Because we've become a liability to your company. Blake started to deny it, then stopped, honesty winning out. Yes. The stock is falling. Investors are nervous. The Westfield deal is shaky. How much? She asked quietly. What? How much money is at stake? If this deal falls through because of Tommy and me? Blake shook his head. It doesn't matter. It does, she insisted. Tell me. Hundreds of millions, he finally admitted. But Cinnamon, listen to me, it's just money. Tommy is what matters now. Dr. Warner's earlier words echoed in her mind, millions for the experimental treatment, specialized transport, extended care. Money that would come from Blake, from his company, from the very empire now threatened by their existence in his life. We should go back to Boston, she said suddenly, the words painful even as she spoke them. After Tommy stabilizes. You can say it was a mistake. That the paternity test was negative. That I tried to mislead you. Blake stared at her in disbelief. What are you talking about? Your board needs a solution. I'm giving you one. Her voice cracked despite her efforts to stay strong. You can deny everything. Say I came to you for money and tried to pass off my son as yours. The media will believe it, the gold digger going after the billionaire. It's a better story anyway. You can't be serious, Blake said, rising to his feet. Your company can pay for Tommy's treatment privately, she continued, the plan forming as she spoke. No one has to know. You can go back to your life, and we'll go back to ours. It's the only way that makes sense for everyone. It makes sense for no one, Blake countered fiercely. Especially not Tommy. Or have you forgotten that he knows now? That he called me a dad this morning? The memory sent fresh pain through her heart. Sometimes the right choice hurts the most. My dear story family, I can see your hearts breaking alongside Blake and Cinnamon's right now. The choice before them seems impossible, career or family, truth or protection, heart or head. What would you do if you were standing in that hospital hallway? Would you choose love or logic? This powerful moment reminds us why sharing these stories matters so much, because they reflect the real choices we all face in life. Sharing your thoughts and engaging means everything to me. So, hit that like button, subscribe to join our story family, and then let's hear your thoughts in the comments below. What choice do you think Blake should make at this point? 3 days later, Blake Morrison stood at a podium in the Grand Metropolitan Hotel's largest conference room, facing a sea of reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. The emergency press conference had been announced just hours before, creating a media frenzy that filled every seat and lined the walls with standing journalists. Behind him stood his executive team, their expressions carefully neutral. His board members occupied the front row, Victoria's tight smile a warning that they expected him to follow the script they'd carefully crafted, the script sitting untouched in his pocket. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Blake began, his voice steady despite the sleepless nights at Tommy's hospital bedside. I've never been one for personal statements. Those who know me understand I prefer to let my work speak for itself. He paused, scanning the room filled with business reporters who'd followed his career for years, documenting his rise without ever glimpsing the man behind the empire. But today isn't about business. It's about something far more important. Blake gestured toward the side door, where Cinnamon now stood with Tommy in a wheelchair, the boy pale but smiling weakly, a bandage wrapped around his head from the procedure that had stabilized his condition. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by the frantic clicking of cameras. This is my son, Thomas Blake Matthews Morrison, Blake announced, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. And this is his mother, Cinnamon Matthews, a woman of extraordinary courage and dignity. He walked over to them, placing one hand on Tommy's shoulder and the other on Cinnamon's back, presenting a united front to the world. 7 years ago, I was unaware I had fathered a child. That was not by choice or design. When I discovered the truth this week, my life changed forever, for the better. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat, recognizing that Blake had gone completely off script. Several board members exchanged worried glances. Tommy is currently fighting a serious medical condition. We will be traveling to Zurich tomorrow for specialized treatment, and I will be taking an indefinite leave from my daily responsibilities at Morrison Enterprises to focus on what matters most, my family. The room erupted with questions, reporters shouting over each other as photographers pushed forward for better angles. Blake raised a hand for silence. I've built a company valued at billions. But nothing is more valuable than this brave young man right here. And nothing will stop me from being the father he deserves. The aftermath of Blake's announcement hit with the force of a financial hurricane. Morrison Enterprises stock plummeted 14 points by closing bell. The Westfield acquisition paused pending further review. Business commentators speculated endlessly about the company's future without its visionary leader at the helm. None of it mattered to Blake as he sat in the private cabin of his jet, watching Tommy sleep peacefully across from him, Cinnamon's hand intertwined with his own. "Your board called again," his assistant said quietly, approaching with a tablet. "They've sent over the latest projections." Blake glanced at the screen, red arrows, downward trends, loss estimates in stark black numbers. 7 years ago, such figures would have kept him awake for days, triggering contingency plans and emergency strategies. Now they seemed like abstract symbols, disconnected from what truly mattered. "Tell them Richard has my proxy for operational decisions," he replied, handing back the tablet. "Otherwise, they'll have to wait until after Tommy's surgery." His assistant nodded, then hesitated. "There's something else. Several major shareholders are threatening to sue, claiming you violated fiduciary responsibility by putting personal interests above company welfare." Cinnamon tensed beside him. "Blake, this is exactly what I was afraid of. You're losing everything you built." He turned to her, his expression serene despite the chaos swirling around them. "I'm not losing anything that matters. I'm gaining everything I never knew I needed." Across the aisle, Tommy stirred, blinking awake. "Dad? Are we in Switzerland yet?" The word "Dad" still sent a jolt through Blake's heart, joy and responsibility in equal measure. "Not yet, buddy. A few more hours." "How are you feeling?" "My head hurts a little," Tommy admitted. "But I'm excited to see the Alps. My geography book says they're the biggest mountains in Europe." Blake moved to sit beside his son, showing him the flight path on the cabin monitor. As they discussed mountain ranges and European geography, Cinnamon watched them with tears shimmering in her eyes. Later, when Tommy had drifted back to sleep, she whispered, "You gave up billions for us." Blake shook his head. "I didn't give up anything. I just finally understood what wealth really means." He looked at Tommy, then back at her. "I spent my life building an empire to prove I mattered, never realizing that nothing matters more than this, being someone's father, someone's." He trailed off, but the way his fingers tightened around hers completed the thought more eloquently than words. The Zurich University Hospital rose from the hillside like a modernist glass sculpture, its reputation as the world's leading neurological center evident in the cutting-edge technology visible through every window. For 2 weeks, it became their world: sterile corridors, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the hushed conversations of medical staff in multiple languages. Dr. Kessler, the Swiss neurosurgeon who pioneered the laser technique, had welcomed them personally upon arrival. "Mr. Morrison, Ms. Matthews, we've reviewed Tommy's scans. The procedure has a 92% success rate in cases like his." Those words had been their lifeline during the grueling 12-hour surgery that followed. Blake and Cinnamon had sat side by side in the waiting room, hardly speaking yet communicating volumes through clasped hands and shared fears. When Dr. Kessler finally emerged, his tired smile told them everything before he spoke. "The procedure went very well. We removed the entire tumor with minimal disruption to surrounding tissue. Your son has a strong spirit." The recovery process proved more challenging than the surgery itself. Tommy, normally so energetic and curious, struggled with the after-effects of anesthesia, the pain of healing, the frustration of temporary vision disturbances that the doctors assured them would fade. Through it all, Blake never left the hospital. He conducted necessary business via video calls from Tommy's room, signed critical documents delivered by courier, and delegated everything else. His assistant transformed one corner of the hospital suite into a makeshift office, but it sat unused most days as Blake focused entirely on his son. He was there for the difficult moments, the night Tommy cried from pain no medication seemed to touch, the morning he panicked when his vision blurred completely for several terrifying minutes. But he was also there for the triumphs, the first wobbly steps around the room, the first clear vision test, the first genuine laugh during a heated game of Go Fish. "You're good at this," Cinnamon remarked one evening, finding Blake helping Tommy build an elaborate fort from hospital blankets and rolling tables. "Being a dad. It's like you've been doing it forever." "I'm just making up for lost time," Blake replied, watching as Tommy carefully balanced a pillow atop their creation. Dr. Kessler's final update came exactly 17 days after the surgery. The latest scans show no remaining tumor cells. The affected nerves are regenerating better than expected. Thomas Blake Morrison is officially in remission. That night, for the first time since they'd arrived, Blake allowed himself to cry, tears of relief, gratitude, and overwhelming love. 6 months later, the Grand Metropolitan Hotel's rooftop garden had been transformed into a fairy tale setting. String lights twinkled overhead like captured stars, while white roses and hydrangeas lined a small aisle created between rows of chairs filled with close friends and family. Tommy stood proudly at the front, his health fully restored, wearing a miniature tuxedo that matched Blake's perfectly. As ring bearer and best son, a title he'd insisted upon, he took his responsibilities with endearing seriousness. "Dad," he whispered loudly, tugging at Blake's sleeve, "Mom looks like a princess." Blake turned toward the garden entrance and felt his breath catch. Cinnamon stood framed in an archway of flowers, radiant in a simple ivory gown that caught the golden sunset light. Her hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, crowned with a delicate circlet of baby's breath. Their journey to this moment had been anything but traditional. The media storm had eventually subsided, replaced by a different narrative as the public watched Blake Morrison transform from ruthless CEO to devoted father and partner. Morrison Enterprises had weathered the transition, emerging stronger under Richard's temporary leadership while Blake focused on what truly mattered. As Cinnamon walked toward him, Blake reflected on the incredible turns his life had taken. The night they'd met had seemed random, a chance encounter between strangers. Yet standing here now, he couldn't help feeling that perhaps some invisible thread had connected them all along, guiding them through separation and reunion toward this perfect moment. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, speaking of second chances and unexpected blessings. When Tommy presented the rings, his face beaming with pride, not a dry eye remained in the gathering. "By the power vested in me," the officiant said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Their kiss was gentle yet profound, a promise, a thank you, a beginning. The reception that followed was joyful and relaxed, nothing like the formal corporate events that had once defined Blake's social calendar. Friends and family danced under the stars while Tommy darted between tables, charming everyone with stories of Switzerland and his new school. Late in the evening, Blake found a quiet moment with his new wife, pulling her close as they watched Tommy demonstrate his robot dance to delighted guests. "I spent my entire life chasing success," Blake murmured against her hair. "I never realized it would find me when I stopped looking, in the form of you and Tommy." Cinnamon smiled up at him. "Some treasures are hidden in plain sight. We just need the right moment to see them." Or the right people to show us, Blake replied, as their son ran toward them, arms outstretched, completing their family circle. My dear family, as we draw to a conclusion of this story, we have to understand that life always presents us with defining moments, crossroads where the easy path diverges sharply from the right one. Blake Morrison faced such a moment in that hospital hallway. The world expected him to protect his empire, to distance himself from complications, to choose the logical business decision. After all, that's what had made him successful, calculating risks, maximizing advantages, prioritizing growth above all else. But sometimes, the most powerful choice we can make is to defy those expectations. To stand firm when pressure tries to bend us. To recognize that the truest measure of success, Blake could have taken the safer route. He could have protected his company, preserved his reputation, maintained the carefully constructed image that had defined him for decades. The world would have understood, perhaps even applauded, such pragmatism. Instead, he chose a different kind of strength. The strength to be vulnerable. The strength to put love above legacy. The strength to become the father Tommy deserved, even at tremendous personal cost. In doing so, he discovered what many of us learn only through similar trials, that our greatest achievements often come disguised as our greatest challenges. That sometimes losing what we thought we wanted opens the door to what we truly need. That families, whether born from blood or built through choice, remain our most precious treasures. The path Blake chose wasn't easy. It came with sacrifice, uncertainty, and painful growth. But it was his path, authentic and true. And in walking it with integrity, he found something far more valuable than the fortune he risked. He found himself, reflected in the eyes of his son and the heart of the woman who had always seen him more clearly than he saw himself. 1 year later, autumn leaves danced across the grounds of Westbridge Academy as parents gathered for the annual Science Innovation Fair. Among them stood Blake and Cinnamon Morrison, checking their programs for the 100th time. Third grade division, table 14, Cinnamon read aloud, barely containing her excitement. Our boy is up against 5th graders who got special permission to compete in this category. Blake nodded, his pride evident despite his attempt at casual confidence. He's been working on this project for months. Even took over my home office with his blueprints. They made their way through the crowded exhibition hall, passing volcanoes and solar systems until reaching table 14. There stood Tommy, now 8 years old and completely recovered, earnestly explaining his project to a cluster of judges in white lab coats. My scale model demonstrates how buildings can harvest rainwater through specialized roof structures, Tommy was saying, pointing to different components of his elaborate creation. The collected water gets filtered through these chambers and stored here, providing sustainable irrigation for the vertical gardens on each level. One judge raised an eyebrow. "And you designed this filtering system yourself?" "Yes, sir," Tommy nodded seriously. "I tested different materials until I found the most efficient combination. Dad helped with some of the math calculations, but the concept is mine." The judge made notes, impressed. "And what inspired this project, young man?" Tommy's face lit up. "In Zurich, my hospital room looked out at a building with gardens on every floor. The doctor told me those gardens helped clean the air and make people healthier. I thought, what if buildings could also collect their own water for those gardens? Then they'd be like living things that take care of themselves." His enthusiasm was contagious, drawing smiles from the judging panel and the small crowd that had gathered. Later that afternoon, when Tommy's name was announced as the division winner, his whoop of joy echoed through the hall. Blake lifted him onto his shoulders while Cinnamon clutched the blue ribbon, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Did you see their faces when I showed them the filtration test results?" Tommy chatted excitedly on the drive home, his trophy secured carefully in his lap. "The lady judge said I might have invented something really important." Blake caught Cinnamon's eye in the rearview mirror, a silent communication passing between them, equal parts wonder and gratitude for this extraordinary child who had transformed their lives in ways they were still discovering. "Mom, Dad," Tommy said suddenly, his voice turning serious, "I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up." "And what's that, sweetheart?" Cinnamon asked. Tommy's answer came without hesitation. "Someone who builds things that help people. Like Dad's company, but also like the doctors who fixed me." "Is that possible?" "With you," Blake replied, his voice thick with emotion, "anything is possible." My dear family, perhaps the most beautiful truth this story reveals is that love doesn't always arrive in expected packages or at convenient times. Sometimes it comes as a surprise visitor, turning our carefully planned lives upside down, asking us to be braver than we ever thought necessary. Cinnamon showed this courage when she raised Tommy alone, working multiple jobs, sacrificing her dreams of medical school to give her son everything he needed. Blake demonstrated it when he chose his newfound family over the empire he'd spent decades building. And little Tommy, perhaps bravest of all, faced a life-threatening illness with the resilience only children seem to naturally possess. Their story reminds us that sometimes the most courageous act isn't facing danger or confronting enemies. Sometimes it's simply opening your heart when it would be safer to keep it closed. It's choosing connection when isolation feels more comfortable. It's risking everything for love when logic argues against it. We all face these crossroads in our own lives, moments where the path forward isn't clear, where fear whispers caution while our hearts urge us toward deeper waters. In those moments, remember Blake, Cinnamon, and Tommy. Remember that the most meaningful journeys often begin with the bravest choices. So, my wonderful story family, thank you for joining me on this journey through Blake, Cinnamon, and Tommy's lives. Your presence here means everything to me. Every comment you share, every emotion you express, reminds me why I do this, because stories connect us all, showing us we're never alone in our struggles or our triumphs. If this touched your heart today, please hit that like button and subscribe to stay part of our growing family. Until our next story adventure, remember that love always finds a way, even through the most unexpected paths. Take care of yourselves and each other. See you soon.